If psychology is the study of the mind and behavior, it also has to be the study of the brain and other biological processes that control behavior in the mind. Today we're going to consider those biological aspects that we need to understand if we're going to understand behavior in the mind. First, we are going to talk about behavior genetics. The fact that we have genes and particular forms of a gene will determine certain kinds of characteristics in behavior. We now have the methodology that allows us to look at genes and look at what alleles or what form of the gene each person possesses. Another use of behavior genetics is to compare heritability. To what extent is a behavior or an aspect of the mind inherited? And we do that by comparing identical twins that live together from identical twins that live apart. It gives us some estimate of what the environmental influence is, the difference between identical twins that have the same genetics, identical twins living apart, having different environments, or identical twins living together having the same environment. There are techniques by looking at family comparisons that behavior geneticists use to help understand whether inheritance or heritability is an important factor for some particular behavior they're interested in. Of course, when we talk about biological influences, we have to talk about the nervous system, the system that allows communication for all parts of the body, including forming motivation and emotions and learning and memory in the brain. There's also an endocrine system. This is a series of ductless glands that secrete hormones that do influence behavior in certain kinds of ways, and we'll talk about those. But the important thing to remember is often it's not just genetics, it's not just the nervous system, it's the environment. Because most characteristics that a person displays in their behavior are controlled by an interaction between the environment and the genetics and the nervous system and the endocrine system. And these interactions are very important, and we need to understand them. Now, I'm going to talk about a study which shows the interaction between genetics and the environment in a very nice way. And it was done by Caspi in 2002 and published in the journal Science. He did a longitudinal study of more than 1,000 people living in New Zealand, and he studied them from when they were young children until they were adults. And he measured all kinds of things in these individuals. He did look at genotype, that is, the particular alleles of the genes that they had. He did look at, in this study, he actually looked at whether or not the kids were abused when they were young, treatment or mistreatment of children, and then later looked at how these factors influence later violent behavior when they became adults. Now, the biological influence was the genotype, and this genotype, particular genotype, this particular allele of a gene determines whether people have a high or low level of a particular enzyme called monoamine oxidase. And this is an enzyme that's used in the nervous system to remove excess neurotransmitters. And you can have either high levels of this because of one allele of the gene, or you can have low levels of this enzyme because of another allele of the gene. So that's the biological factor, the actual genetic factor that determines whether you have high or low levels of this enzyme. The environmental factor, of course, is whether you experience child abuse in childhood, whether or not you report that you did, whether you felt you were mistreated or you were treated correctly. And we'll see that he actually uses that at several levels. And we measure whether the person was convicted of a violent crime when they were an adult. Okay, this is the results from that study. And remember, they're correlations. So we have to always remember that we're measuring lots of things in people, and then we're looking at things that are related to each other. So the dependent variable here is the percent conviction of violent crimes from 0% to 100%. And the genotype factor, the biological factor, is whether they have low levels of this enzyme MAO or high levels of MAO. And the other environmental factor was whether they have evidence of severe child abuse, evidence of probable child abuse, or no child abuse. So we have three levels. And here are the results of the experiment, of the study. And you can see it's a very interesting finding. First, we found that if you have low levels of MAO, you have more violent adult behavior than if you have high levels of MAO. So high levels of MAO seems to somehow buffer violent crimes in adulthood. If you look at the environmental factor of child abuse, low, probable, and severe, you can see that the effects of child abuse are much greater when you look at low versus severe, much greater in the low MAO group than in the high MAO group. So here we have a perfect interaction. The results show this interaction between nature and nurture, between biology and the environment in determining behavior. In this particular study, between a particular genotype and experience of child abuse in predicting violent behavior in adults. So what this study actually tells us is, first, there are biological influences, there are environmental influences that shape us as individuals, that shape our behavior, and often there's an interaction among them that determines this. Caspi, 2002. Now let's talk about the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a series of ductless glands that throughout the body that produce hormones, and these hormones are produced, controlled by the nervous system, by the way. The part of the brain called the hypothalamus determines whether or not these hormones are being produced or not. And the function of the hormones are two. One is they regulate bodily processes. That is, they regulate sort of our viscera, the heart, the amount of calcium in the blood, the amount of sugar in the blood. All of those are regulated by these hormones. And then it also creates a hormone coming from the adrenal gland, creates a fight or flight response, and I'm going to talk about that. But it's what happens when you have a very sudden, existing, frightening kind of experience. Like if the door opened here in this room and a bear walked in, I would have the fight or flight response. I need to do something in response to this sort of threat that's in my environment. Now, just to give you some of the glands that are in the endocrine system and describe a little bit about what it does. The first is the pituitary gland, which is actually very close to the base of the brain, and it's considered the master gland because it secretes hormones that actually affects other glands. By the way, the hormones are secreted into the bloodstream in the endocrine system, and the hormone produced by the pituitary gland actually stimulates other glands to go into action. For example, the fight or flight response is first triggered by the pituitary gland affecting the adrenal gland. The pineal gland is actually located in the brain, and it produces melatonin, which is a hormone that allows us to sleep and be aroused. It's really the hormone that allows us to controls the level of arousal. And we use it when we go to sleep to reduce the level of arousal. The thyroid gland, which is primary influence on metabolism. The parathyroids, which primarily influences the level of calcium in the blood. The adrenal glands, which, as I mentioned, produces adrenaline, which is a hormone that produces lots of things in the fight or flight response. The pancreas gland, which controls the sugar in the blood, again, bodily functions, and then with the adrenal glands, the fight or flight response. And the testis and the ovary, the sex glands that secrete sex hormones, depending upon whether you're a male or a female. Now let's look at the fight or flight response. It's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system, and we'll talk about that in another lecture module. But basically, it's the release of a lot of things happen when the sympathetic activation occurs, primarily activated by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland secretes a hormone, and that starts the fight or flight response. But a lot of other things happen in response to the hormone and to the sympathetic nervous system. For example, I mentioned adrenaline is the hormone that the adrenal glands secrete, which increases our arousal. Large blood vessels dilate, so blood can move faster through them, so blood flow is actually increased. You notice when you have these kind of responses, your hair sort of stands up. I actually notice that in my dog when it's very stressful. Its back hair sort of stand up. Pupils dilate. Salivation is slowed. Often you'll have a dry mouth kind of response to the flight or fight response. The heart rate and blood pressure is increased as the arousal is increased. The liver releases glucose, so you have plenty of energy, and the sweat glands activate. In fact, one of the tests that psychologists use to measure arousal is the galvanic skin response, where you actually look at the resistance on the palm of the hand caused by sweat, by water being there or not being there, and you sweat when you have these aroused kind of things, and that produces sweating in the palm, and that can be measured as a galvanic skin response. And then muscle tensions increase as you get ready to act, either run or fight. So today we've looked at biological influences on behavior. We talked about the endocrine system, we talked about the nervous system, we talked about genetics, and the important fact that often the environment interacts with these biological systems to really control behavior and what is going on in our mind. Thank you.